Well, hi, I'm Rick Sandak. I'm one of the Sandak siblings, one of 5 siblings who were blessed and honored to have been raised by Alberta Henry, the one and only Alberta Henry. And we call her our alma mater. And and thankfully, because of our blessed parents, Helen and Wally Sandak, who who hired Alberta in 1949. She had come to Salt Lake City from Topeka, Kansas, where she was recovering from a ruptured appendix. And in Topeka, Kansas, she'd incurred a peritonitis infection that almost sent her to her grave. And a dear friend of hers named Dorothy Mills, who's married to Herbert Mills, one of the famous Mills brothers, and Google it. They're amazing. And she was Alberta's dear friend. And she suggested, well, first of all, she saw how Alberta was emaciated, had lost weight from like 108 to a frightening 66 pounds. And she went back to the white clinic that basically sent Alberta home to die because they were ill-equipped to handle people of color, quote unquote. And Dorothy was so incensed that she went back to that hospital and she said, I want you to send out someone, a white doctor, take care of this woman. A Dr. Fred Ford, I think, took a chance and went into that neighborhood, segregated Topeka, Kansas, and they brought her back to health over a period of time and restored her health from this peritonitis. And her sister Dorothy, her friend Dorothy, suggested that she go to Salt Lake City to recuperate. Berta had been married to this alcoholic womanizer who ran the cafe that she and her husband split. And Berta just said, forget it. She divorced the guy, gave him the cafe, got out of the marriage. And on the suggestion of Dorothy Mills, who had a sister and friends and family in Salt Lake City, said, go out to Salt Lake City to recuperate. So she had a one-way ticket to Salt Lake City. She came here. She recalls that the solemnity and the whiteness of the snow, underscoring the whiteness of the population, was so silent and so quiet that she, nothing was shaken, as Alberta used to say. But she shook things up pretty good. And in the classifieds, people of color, the only jobs they could get were janitorial and domestics. And so she applied for a domestic job. My mother had put a want ad out, and it's a classic Alberta story that just defines her character and her independence and her fierceness to a T. When she showed up at my parents' door on the big white house on the hill on Walcott Street, and Berta had told the cab driver to keep the motor running because she had a hot date with a guy named Harold Henry, and he was a waiter on the Union Pacific. And they were going to party at the Waiters and Porters Club down by the Union Pacific. And she wanted to get the interview over with. So she rings the doorbell, and my mother comes to the door, and my mother sees this woman all dolled up in fur, beautifully coiffed, heels, lipstick, the whole works. And my mother does a double take. And, it's not like she's, dressed appropriately for domestic work. And my mother's thinking maybe she more or less she would fit better in the red light districts on 2nd South. Because she was hot. And so she invited her in, and they had a little, interview in the living room. And Berta flat out told her no when my mother asked her if she's ever done domestic work. I've never done domestic work. Well, do you know how to cook? No. She didn't know how to cook, but she hated it. Well, do you have any references? No. This is the first job I've ever applied to. And at that point, my mother's thinking, this is not looking so good for Alberta. But at that point, my little brother Artie, who was 8 months old, crawls into the living room. And Berta's eyes lit up, like I say in the book, like a menorah on the 8th day of Hanukkah. Her eyes just lit up when she saw this child whom she went and picked up and adored from the start. I mean, it chokes me up thinking about it, because my mother's next question was, do you like children? And she didn't even have to answer. She really didn't have to answer the question, because she knew in her heart that this woman would be ideal for us. And bang, she went with her gut instinct, and she said, I want this woman. I want her. I don't care what background she came with. She doesn't have experience, and I want her. And Berta wisely negotiated her salary from $15 a week to $25. She was that adamant about, making sure she got taken care of. My father said, we'll just have to give up orange juice. And that's how we came to fall in love with Berta, and vice versa. And she moved into the house on November 7th, 1949, Election Day. And that began our love affair with the one and only Alberta Henry.
Fantastic.
So that was that. And there's some wonderful stories that the last time we saw Alberta was in 2005. I guess I could hold off on this and say, well, no. At any rate, the last time we saw Alberta was in 2003. And my mother and my sister Nancy and I drove in this blizzard to get to her house in West Valley. And Berta, I think, was on a breathing device. I think, I guess from a pulmonary condition or something. I guess from all those years of the cumulative effects of all those years from smoking Cool cigarettes. Cools, so that was her number one cigarette of choice. And she inhaled deeply, and she loved those Cool cigarettes. I don't know if she later switched to Newport menthol or not, but she loved those Cool cigarettes. She loved it. She laughed. She laughed like nobody you ever met in your life. Her laugh was just glorious. And to give you an example of just how glorious her laugh was, my sister Nancy once asked her, when she was a precocious 8-year-old, she said to Alberta, and they were walking together at Reservoir Park, and my sister Nancy said, well, Berta, how come you don't have any children? And Berta said, well, the Lord just didn't bless me in that way. And Nancy said, well, Mommy said that Daddy plants baby seeds in her, and that's how we came to be. Why can't Daddy plant baby seeds in you so that you can have children? And Alberta lost it. I mean, she laughed so hard that I thought her appendix was going to burst again. But her appendix was long gone by then. But it would have. And she just fell over, crippled, and laughed. She laughed so hard that a woman pulled over at the side of the road and asked her if she could call emergency help. Berta waved her off. And that was just classic. And I don't know if this is for the documentary or not, but another time I remember Berta was in the kitchen and I had some kind of little infection or something. Like, kept saying to my dad, I was about 5 or 6, Daddy, my penis hurts, my penis itches, Daddy, and well, come here and let me see your penis and let's take care of it. And then I'm going, it itches, Daddy, my penis, all through dinner. And Alberta's in the kitchen. And she overhears this, and now she clears the table. Now it's time to come out and ask for, dessert. And she came out and she said, "Who wants peanuts or peaches?" And we laughed, we cracked up, and Alberta she just flushed, and she went back into the kitchen and we never saw her again. She stayed in the kitchen for the next week. She was just so embarrassed, but it was hysterical. And we recalled these stories at her house in 2003. That's where she would hold court as the queen and court jester. And we all gathered around her and recalled these great stories. Like the story, my mom was alive at the time, and my mom would never forget how my mother gave Berta the cooking assignment she let the asparagus out to cook asparagus. And she came home at the end, and Alberta had taken, not asparagus, artichokes. What would a daughter of a sharecropper in Topeka, Kansas know from artichokes, right? So she, at the end of the day, my mother comes home, and Berta had stripped the artichokes of all their leaves, thrown them in the garbage, and stripped the artichokes for nothing, little nothing. And that was her experience with artichoke. Berta was shamed, and my mother just laughed it off, because what would a daughter of a sharecropper's, know from artichokes, and we recalled those stories. And oh my God, we recalled so much that afternoon. Berta was always the one who green-lighted when we were old enough to get married. The official procedure in our house was to get the okay from Berta to green-light our marriage. And if she liked the guy or the girl, and we got Berta's okay, then bang, we could proceed into the world of marital harmony. And so Nancy's boyfriend from Berkeley was this sweet, cute guy that she liked, and I forgot his name, but Nancy came home with this guy, and Nancy just really liked him, loved him, and Berta checked him out, and Berta said made the official review, and it was no go. And we said, Berta said, "Well, why? What's wrong with this guy?" It had nothing to do with Jewish or not Jewish. I don't think he was Jewish, but he just, And Berta's response was, "He's not one of us. He doesn't really fit in the family." Something like that. And I got engaged to my first wife, Mary, and she just smooth sailing. Berta loved her and green lighted that. I got married. That lasted for about 2 weeks. That marriage crumbled after about 5 years, like bad blue cheese at Albertsons. And I finally said to Berta, Nancy's marriage and then Berta okayed Nancy's marriage to Lewis, a prominent doctor, pediatrician here in Salt Lake. That lasted a long, long time until that marriage fell apart. And I finally said to Berta in that living room that day, I said, to the quote-unquote almighty, all-knowing seer of matrimonial, well-being, you always gave us the green light on these people, and we all got divorced. What do you have to say about that? She said, "Well, I never said it would work out." So she was she was a piece of work. Alberta was a piece of work, and she was no nonsense. I think the most definitive Alberta Henry story took place in 1971 when she was awarded an honorary doctorate, honorary PhD at the University of Utah. And as she always liked to say, I I was given an honorary PhD before I ever graduated from college. I'm the only black woman in the state of Utah who was given an honorary PhD before graduating from college. Well, there she was on the podium at the University of Utah, and they had cordoned off a big section of the football field for all the graduates to sit there. And my mother and I were there. I can't remember if Susie was with us or Nancy, but Mom and I were there. There was Alberta, all decked out in graduation clothing, her black hat, and the thing. And so they were awarding two other people, a scientist, a Nobel Prize winning scientist named George Wald, and Utah's famous Republican Senator Wallace F. Bennett. And so they were the other PhD recipients. So after the ceremony, backstage, I like to say Alberta shot from the lip. And if anybody had never met Alberta and you pressed the wrong button, you better watch out. You better know in advance or you're going to get ambushed. And Wallace F. Bennett, to his detriment, did not know Alberta Henry, even though she was one of his constituents in the great beehive state of Utah. And in this pompous, arrogant way backstage, he said to her, well, why don't you come back to Washington sometime, and I'll show you around Washington, D.C. How about that? And she said, I have no interest in coming to Washington, D.C. to check that out. Well, when you've done zero for black people in Salt Lake City, Utah, you've never come to our neighborhood once. You don't know what we do. She just went on and on. And this guy went into a freeze mode. Governor Rampton at the time was just standing back and watching the show. And she's going, you never did zip for black people. You didn't da-da-da-da-da. And he was silenced into this, like he just got hit by a vampire bat. He was, huh? And he walked out with his little PhD in hand, and he had just experienced the wrath of Alberta Henry, who represented, Salt Lake's black community in that way. You've never done zero for us. Why should I come to Washington, D.C.? And he hadn't. He'd written a Mormon hymn that's in the Mormon LDS hymn book, hymn number 150. God is great, God is good, or something like that, And I just thought that was a divine God. I said, God is good, God is great, when he made choreograph that moment, that divine moment where Alberta Henry leveled him with her lip, and he got a taste of just who this woman is. And ironically, Rampton, Governor Rampton was back there, and he took this, he watched that whole thing down, and later Alberta played a significant role in his third term. She was on his the Black Council, this and that. I had so many names on her resume is 8 pages thick, from Nixon to this and that. She was president of Head Start, president of the NAACP. She was, Deidre will take care of that, of all that stuff. But her resume is that thick, but in that room that day, there was a big picture. It'd be great if Deidre could get this picture of Harold Henry overlooking us all sitting around, because Harold died a few years earlier, and he was a waiter on the Union Pacific. We used to like to joke that Utah had, the black population of Salt Lake City was a half of 1%, and that there was no black population when the Union Station left town. All the blacks were on there, and that was maybe a bad joke, but that's how limited the job opportunities were for blacks back then. And then I remember there was this god-awful restaurant in Salt Lake City, and Salt Lake City was like the flagship restaurant for this restaurant called I think it was called the Coon Chicken Inn, of all names. What obviously wouldn't survive in today's climate, thankfully. But back then, in like 1925, it opened up. So you entered the head of a huge porter, of a train porter with a red cap and his teeth spelled out Coon Chicken, and big grinning smile, and you walked through his mouth and ordered chicken. And everybody was happy, and they even had the baby coon menu. And oh my God, it just killed you. I mean, it killed you. And all these blacks, and the only opportunity to work in this god-awful restaurant, would just smile and, and, it wasn't Step and Fetch at time, but it was, or Jim Crow, but it was, what were their choices? And I said, Alberta, God, how did you feel every time you saw that god-awful restaurant coming around I think it was on Holiday Boulevard? And she just said it was a double whammy. We got beat up for being black. It's like you got beat up for being born, and then you got beat up to see this god-awful, reprehensible, talk about urban blight. I mean, it was horrific. I don't know what happened. Of course, it's gone now, and you could Google it, and you would see just how reprehensible and atrocious this place was. But to everybody else, it was like, let's go to the Coon Chicken Inn, And, but I remember saying, but what was even more reprehensible, and talk about a double whammy, was the dose was the double whammy that black students got in high school in their education. And Alberta called it a catch-22. The only blacks that went to college there were athletes who got there on athletic scholarships, and you had to be some kind of gifted jock to do that. And you couldn't take a student's loan because blacks didn't have the money to pay it back. So they were trapped that way, and they couldn't get scholarships to pay it back, da-da-da-da-da-da. And it was a catch-22. And they were trapped. And Alberta saw the hopelessness. Alberta saw that if they can't get an education, they're going to retro back to drugs, to pregnancy, to unwanted children, to just that whole god-awful cycle of poverty and helplessness. So she began with collecting, nickels and dimes and putting, kids together, and my father, who was a labor lawyer and big prominent social activist in the community, just said, hey, look, let's incorporate. Let's go after some charitable people, and let's target some people, and let's incorporate it. And they got together with Ben Rowe, who became the treasurer, and in his own memoir called Alberta a Human Dynamo. And there was another woman named Virginia Hyatt. She was a representative of the women's church something group in Utah, and the three of them got together and they incorporated it. And they said, well, we're going to put minority kids through college. What should we call it? And they said, well, let's call it the Alberta Henry Education Foundation. And Alberta said, no, I don't want you to call it that. I'm not dead yet. and they overruled her, and they said, yes, we're calling it that. So, like in about 6 years' time, they had put 150 kids, minority kids, most of them black, through college. And that was the main reason for, they broke down the doors of racial segregation at the University of Utah. And they got these kids in. And they were the top-notch kids at schools who did the best, and they deserved a chance. And that was the format. And they put 150 kids through college in about 6 years' time. And 80 of these kids had multiple degrees too, as well. And they were, Deidre couldn't tell you more about it, but there was a judge, some judge, it's in the book, I forget his name, David something. He's all kinds of professions, you know, architects and judges and you know, and so she's got the wheels in motion to get these kids going. And she, you know, put an end to that, did her best to put an end to that double whammy that kept these kids in that stagnation and place of just unnecessary, you know, mind the potential of these kids. And I think today, Harvey Boyd would know better, but I think they've got 500 plus as today kids, not just blacks, but all minorities. Send them to tech schools and vocational schools and the University of Utah and Weber State and this state and that state and this college and that kid. Whatever the kids shined in. And that's her legacy. And when she had her ruptured appendix, and her peritonitis, and they thought she was going to die, she remembers seeing a white light at the foot of her bed. And she remembers hearing God. She remembers hearing God speak to her, saying, "You're not going to die. I have work for you. There is work for you." And it was enough, so sustaining for her to make a comeback from that illness and not die. Thank God she didn't die. What would this place be without Alberta Henry? Without these 500, 600, it's still, the Education Foundation is still operative to this day. And if you want to give, here it is. So she saw that white light, and other people thought it was like a hallucinogenic thing, you know, but it wasn't. She said, that was God talking to me. I remember I wrote a story about her called When God Spoke, Alberta Henry Listened. And she listened, and when she came to Utah, and she realized the struggle that blacks face in Utah, which in many ways she said was even harder than those in the Deep South, because don't forget, here she is in a community who according to the doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint, that black people were the offspring of Cain's illicit communion with Lucifer as pigmentation punishment for God knows what. You know, had nothing to do with evolution, had nothing to do with how hot the sun is in Africa and turns your skin brown so that you can live. Had nothing to do with that. It had everything to do with, you're cursed, your skin's cursed, you're in cohorts with the devil. We don't like you. We hate you. And they adopted that attitude when they looked. They'd smile at you, you know, and you could work for them, but they knew that you were cursed with that god-awful thing. And she knew what this community had been steeped in, had been raised to believe in. Hardcore, you know, and she went, "Oh God, this is where I have to be." And God's, "Yeah, Utah, this is where they need you." And that was her revelation. And as I think it was Lance, I'm forgetting the reporter's name, Lance Christensen said, Alberta Henry, from the a Tribune writer said, when Alberta Henry came to Salt Lake City to recover from a ruptured appendicitis from Topeka, Kansas, and had a revelation, Salt Lake, you know, would never change again, or something like that, you know. And she changed Utah. That was her legacy. And you know, my father, God bless him, my mother hired him, and you know, the rest is her story, as they say. Oh, thank you.
Boy, that was good.
Good.
That was excellent.
Bravo.
So wonderful.
That doesn't even need